The old house loomed, dark and silent, a brooding giant against the dying light. The documentary crew, armed with cameras and nervous excitement, stepped inside. Dust lay thick, undisturbed for years. It swirled around their feet, a ghostly shroud. The air hung heavy, stale and cold. A musty odor filled their nostrils, the smell of decay and forgotten memories. A shiver ran down their spines. Something felt wrong.
Wow, this place is creepy.
The others nodded in agreement, their eyes darting around the shadowy hallway. Cobwebs clung to every surface, thick and gray like ancient shrouds. The silence pressed in on them, broken only by their own breathing and the distant creak of the house settling around them. A sense of unease settled over the group, a feeling that they were not alone.
Let's get started.
They moved deeper into the house. Each room echoed the same eerie stillness. Furniture stood draped in dusty sheets, like ghosts of the family that once lived there. They found a child's room. A rocking horse stood frozen mid-gallop. A doll lay discarded on the floor, its painted eyes staring blankly. On the walls, childish drawings depicted stick figures with haunting smiles.
This is getting weird.
One drawing made Sarah pause. It showed a family of 4, but the figures were scratched out violently. Only one small figure remained untouched. A child with wide, terrified eyes. A sudden gust of cold air swept through the room, stirring the dust motes into a frenzy. The rocking horse creaked back and forth as if pushed by an unseen hand. The crew exchanged nervous glances. The air crackled with an unseen energy. Something was watching them. As they explored further, the feeling of unease intensified. Footsteps echoed from the floor above, slow and deliberate. A door slammed shut with a resounding boom. The sounds were faint, distant, but undeniably real. The crew froze, their blood turning to ice.
Did you hear that?
It's probably just the wind.
But his face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. They listened intently, their hearts pounding in their ears. The house seemed to hold its breath, the silence broken only by their ragged breathing. Then it came again. A child's giggle, high-pitched and chilling, echoing through the empty hallway.
This is too much. We need to get out of here.
Panic threatened to overwhelm them. They stumbled back down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the silence. As they reached the top of the stairs, a figure flickered in the moonlight, filtering through a dusty window. Small and shadowy, it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. But they had seen it. A child. Its eyes glowed with an eerie light.
Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. Emily stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet. Mark swore under his breath, his face ashen. Only Ben seemed transfixed, his camera still pointed at the spot where the figure had been. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice hoarse with terror. "It was a child. I saw it. They didn't need confirmation. They had all seen it. The ghostly apparition of a child trapped within the walls of the abandoned house. Their fear turned to sheer terror. They had to get out, now!"
They scrambled down the stairs, their equipment clattering against the walls. The house seemed to press in on them, its coldness seeping into their bones. They burst out of the front door and into the night air. The cool night air hit their faces like a slap. They didn't stop running until they reached their van parked down the road. Gasping for breath, they piled inside, slamming the doors behind them. The engine roared to life, shattering the silence of the night. As they sped away, Sarah risked a glance back at the house. It stood silhouetted against the moonlit sky, its windows dark and empty. But she could have sworn she saw a figure standing in the upstairs window, a small, shadowy figure watching them go. Back at their temporary headquarters, a motel room on the outskirts of town, they huddled around a laptop, the events of the night still fresh in their minds. They had to review the footage to see if they had captured anything. anything at all.
Ben slotted the memory card from his camera into the laptop. The screen flickered to life, displaying the files. They scrolled through the footage, each frame filled with the same eerie stillness, the same palpable sense of dread. And then they saw it. At the very end of the footage, a brief clip, barely a few seconds long. The child. It stood at the end of the hallway, its back to the camera. It was wearing a white dress, its hair long and dark. It turned its head slowly, and for a fleeting moment they saw its face. Pale and gaunt, with eyes that burned with an unnatural light. And then it smiled.
A cold chill swept through the room. The smile, it was wrong, twisted, full of malice. It wasn't the innocent smile of a child. It was the smile of something else, something evil.
Suddenly, the lights in the motel room flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Screams filled the sudden silence. Then, a different sound. A low, guttural growl coming from somewhere in the room. Something cold and sharp pressed against Sarah's throat. "Don't move," a voice whispered in her ear, cold and menacing, "or you'll join them." The voice wasn't the voice of a child. It was the voice of a monster, and it was closer than they thought.